Our next lecture is a series of Beyond Medicine lectures. It is my pleasant task tonight to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Chandani Vanigatunga. She is a physician and chair professor of pharmacology, Faculty of Medical Sciences, University of Sri Jayawardenepura. She is also the deputy director, PGIM, University of Colombo. She is a past president of the Ceylon College of Physicians in year 2019. Her interests are in history, archaeology, and Buddhist art. She enjoys wildlife and photography. I'm sure we will get a glimpse of her work during these next 30 minutes. May I invite Professor Chandani Vanigatunga to the podium. Over to you, Chandani.
Okay, thank you very much, Kamani, for that introduction. Thank you very much, Duminda and the Council, for this invitation to talk on something which is beyond medicine. I think you're continuing on this tradition to keep me away from my technical expertise and giving me an area that I can talk anyway about. This is my pleasure. So I'm honored because I know that college can always get an expert to talk about it. So I hope I'll be able to do justice as I take you through what I plan to do over the next 40 minutes with you. Okay, so when we look at any religious art, it's a unique area. So I'm going to concentrate on Buddhist art because that is something that I do have an idea about, particularly what it entails as well. So if you look at Buddhist art, it is the visual art produced in the context of Buddhism. And you see it in buildings, sculptures, paintings, and so on. Buddhist art originated in the 5th century BC after the parinirvana of the Buddha in India, followed wherever the Dhamma went, and in doing so, it got involved in the culture of the countries that it went to. Like with any other art, Buddhist art will also need patrons because you need somebody who has to give the financial support for it. Monks to provide guidance, and also in this instance to accept it in their temples. Craftsmen, of course, to execute it, who will be doing what the monks say sometimes, but with a lot of freedom to do what they want. And of course, the people to accept it, without which there would be no art. So my topic today is Buddhist art of the Sinhalese. And I selected this topic because of a question asked by one of my colleagues. What is Buddhist art? Is it different from other religious art? And why do we keep on saying it is the Sinhala Buddhist art? Is it different? So when he asked me that, I'm sorry he's not here in the audience, but when he asked me that, I thought it's something worth looking at. What exactly makes Buddhist art of the Sinhalese different to what you see elsewhere? And I started looking at it in detail. And over the next 30 to 35 minutes, I will take you through 22 centuries of Buddhist art of the Sinhalese. When you look back at the 2nd century BC, the 3rd century BC, the country at that point was open to the world. We were close to India, separated only with a narrow little bit of water. It was strategically placed so that whoever who came from the east and the west could come to the country. It was also such that all our seaports were connected through waterways to the main cities. So whoever who came could easily go to the waterways and stay there. So tradesmen came from Europe as well as from the Far East. They stayed in the country, exchanged ideas and thoughts and religious beliefs. It is to this society that Arhat Mahinda brought the doctrine in the 3rd century BC. He was followed by his sister Theri Sangamitta, who brought the sacred bow sapling to the country. With Theri Sangamitta came various artisans and craftsmen who stayed in the country with her, and they got involved with the local people and shared their thoughts, whatever they knew, their techniques with them. So Buddhist art in the island originally was heavily influenced by Indian art. But by the 2nd century BC, our people had evolved so that they developed a separate Buddhist art, a style which was unique to the Sinhalese in the island. So the earliest Buddhist art form that we know is the stupa, which started with the Buddha Parinirvana when the Buddha's relics were distributed to people. So they enshrined it in a stupa, and although they may have been there from the 5th century BC, the earliest ones we see in India are actually after that period. So the first one that comes into mind is the Sanchi, which was originally commissioned by Emperor Asoka. So it then follows that the structure of the stupa that would have originally come to Ceylon would be like what was seen at the Sanchi, where you get a dome with a parasol on top, which is meant to shelter and honor the relic that is enshrined. The earliest stupas, according to Mahavansa, is the Tuparama and the Yatala stupa, but we don't see this structure today in these stupas because they have undergone a lot of evolution. And that is something that we see in Sri Lankan Buddhist art or Sinhala Buddhist art. It evolved with time. So at any given time, you will see sometimes the entire 22 centuries in one particular place. So the only place where you might see this structure is at the Sandagiri Stupa. If you go to Tisamaharama, you'll suddenly see one part of the stupa in the middle of the village. You go around to another part of the village and you see the Padanagara, showing us that over time, people have grown over those places, built over those places, and it's scattered over a vast area. But it's one complex. So this is the earliest structure that is available to us in Sri Lanka. Now in India too, the Sanchi was expanded during the Satavahana period. And what they did was they added a railing between the stupa, giving a space so that you could circumambulate around the stupa, giving a pradakshina-patha. And these railings, around this railing, they had 4 massive toranas or arches facing the 4 directions. Now this facing the 4 direction is important in Buddhist art because it signifies that people from all 4 corners can come and worship the Buddha. And it also signifies that Buddha's teaching will go to all 4 directions. So the 4 directions are important in Buddhist art, wherever it comes from. The classical thing in these toranas are these carvings, the carvings of Buddha's life, as well as stories from the Jataka, which are there in the toranas. And incidentally, we don't have any of these from the past in the Sinhala Buddhist art. However, these 2 plaques, which were found in the Anuradhapura region way back, which are now at the National Museum, show the Mahamaya Devi's dream and its interpretation. These have been carved in what is known as Andhra marble, which is not available in Ceylon. At that time, it wasn't there. It's not there now as well. But more interestingly, they are pretty much like what you see today in the British Museum. These 2 plaques which have been excavated from the Amaravati Stupa region. So possibly, it is postulated that the merchants who came or the travelers who came from the Andhra Desha brought these plaques and gave them as votive offerings to the Bodhigaras in the country. And that is probably how they ended up in Ceylon. Now, we see a semblance of the original stupas in places like Madirigiriya and Tiriyaya, but we see the Buddhist railing in some of these. But over and above that, we have gone beyond and built what is known as a Vatadage, where you get the columns and a roof-like structure which goes over the stupa, covering it. So Tuparamaya is the oldest stupa in the country, but we don't see, except for those columns, we don't see anything from the earlier sites. But when you look at Tiriyaya and Madirigiriya, we see the Vatadage structure still intact, showing how we have evolved from the original Sanchi style. Of course, we went beyond. And by the time it came towards the time of King Dutugamanu, we had started building massive stupas which were way beyond what the Sanchi stupa was in styles. So if you take Ruan Valley Sai, it's about 8 times more taller than the Sanchi even when it was built. In addition to that, we had massive Salapatara Malu to go around this place. Due to its size, they didn't have the Toranas. It was impossible to build such tall structures. However, the artisans in the country had a different style where they built what were known as frontispieces or Vahalkadas, again in the 4 directions. They sometimes doubled up as the Mallasana, where people could come and place some flowers and worship the stupas. What is interesting in these Vahalkadas are the carvings that you see, which gives you an idea of the capability of the Sinhala artists. All these Vahalkadas will also have an animal on top, again signifying the 4 directions. So you will see the bull, the lion, the horse, and the elephant. And each animal will have a designated direction to which it is attached to, or which is meant to be there. So when you look at these Vahalkadas, we see various carvings again. And what I have shown here is from the front Ayakastamba. Now the Vahalkadas have on their sides pillars which are known as Ayakastambas. And this front Ayakastamba from the Jetavanadagaba shows a carving. Again, similar to what you get from a pillar at the Amaravati Stupa currently at the British Museum, showing how much we have got from the Indian subcontinent. Of course, a different one from the Indian subcontinent is this. You see these drawings in the Ayakastamba, which has what was thought to be a kalpa vruksha. So you have a pot of plenty, and from that you get the creeper or the tree rising. So if you look at this carefully, you will see that this tree is different. Instead of a tree, what the pot gives rise to are the candelabra. And then from there you get the acanthus leaves. You also see animals and figures which are not part of the Asian cultures. You see a griffin. You see a cherub or a cupid. Now, how did these come into our art? Interestingly, the historians think that these came with the Greek traders or the Roman traders who came to the country, who stayed in the country until their ships went back. They would have commissioned the artists and made an offering to the temple. So we see a Greek influence as well in the Buddhist art. So the country where it was, we had people coming, we got from them and we used it as part of our art. Of course, the Nagas play a very significant role in Buddhist art. And these are images that we see in Sri Lanka. As you can see, we see both the zoomorphic form and the anthropomorphic form of the Naga. And they too initially were similar to what was carved in India. Looking at the entrance to our Buddhist structures, we see the moonstone. And moonstone in a very basic form was seen even in India, and that is how it started. It came to Sri Lanka. So we also have in certain buildings this basic semicircular moonstone at the end, at the base, at the entrance to any building. Of course, we went beyond and we carved some of the most exquisite moonstones that are seen in the world today. We went beyond and carved the steps that go from the moonstone to the building, added wing stones, and decorated them as time went on. But the crowning glory are these anthropomorphic Nagarajas, which are not found in any other part of the world. These are among the most exquisitely carved anthropomorphic Nagarajas in the world today. They carry a pot of plenty and also a branch which has leaves, flowers, and buds, signifying prosperity. They stand guard at the beginning, at the entrance to a relic chamber or a temple. And depending on the place, the number of hoods would vary from 3 to 9. I have shown, I think, one with 9, the other one with 7. Apparently, there are Nagarajas with hoods of 11 as well, but I've never seen one still. Um, Interestingly, this complex of the moonstone, the steps, the two wing stones at the sides, and then that particular and the guard stones in front are unique to Sinhala Buddhist architecture and is not seen anywhere else in the world. So we got influence from the Indians who came to us, and then we developed and went beyond, as you see, with these structures. In the earlier times, there was no statues, especially because the Theravada Buddhism does not believe in trappings. So people worshipped the stupas, the bodhiyas, and of course, later on, iconographic representation of the Buddha, like the Siripatul Gal. But of course, later on, people wanted something more, and they carved statues. And the earliest statues in India were gigantic structures, mainly to give a superhuman quality to the Buddha. So, what you see is some of the features of a Mahapurusha, the snail like hair on top, the usnisha or the fleshy protuberance on the scalp, and the urna in the middle, and of course, the long hanging ears. We see the same thing in one of the sculptures that you see at Sandagiri Stupa. Again, the marble is not found in Ceylon. So it is postulated that either they brought the marble and the artisans from Gandhara and got it carved here, or they did it there and brought it here and then made an offering to Sandagiri Stupa. Interestingly, when we carved the standing Buddhas in Ceylon, we changed the mudra. Now, usually the standing Buddha is seen with an Abhaya mudra, where in the Indian statues you get the palm facing forwards. When it came to the Sri Lankan artists, they quietly turned the hand to the side. So it's not facing forwards, but slightly turned inwards. And that is seen with these carvings which are there from the Anuradhapura period. The seated Buddha statues also are different. The earlier ones show a much more coarser features, and as time went on, they became very fine. And interestingly, these three lines in the front of the neck apparently reflect the influence of the Mathura school. At the same time, round about the 3rd century, Mahayana Buddhism was also coming up in India. And it was only natural that it came to Sri Lanka as well. And we see evidence of Mahayana Buddhism with these statues, these beautifully carved statues which are found in the National Museum. And that is one place which is worth a visit, $100 a ticket. That's one of $100 that is spent so well because you get so many things to see there. Now, interestingly, with these carvings, they are much more royal in their appearance, very princely, very fluid when you compare it with the Buddha statues, and the mudras are also slightly more different. They caught on, especially because we had the Abhayagiriya clan who were open for different ideas, more progressive ideas. And these statues came from the Anuradhapura side. We don't see major monasteries of Mahayana in Anuradhapura, but there were no such limitations in the south. South was a different kingdom, although it was under the same king. And there we see evidence of huge Mahayana complexes like Budruagala. Off the beaten track, one of the loveliest places to be. And there we see statues, gigantic statues of the Mahayana Buddhas, two main groups. On the one side, you see Avalokiteshvara, identified by the statue of Buddha in his Jata Makuta, and Maitri on the other side. Now, it's important to remember that these two were venerated more than the others in Sri Lanka. And as time goes on, I'll show you how they became incorporated into mainstream Buddhism. Of course, with many Chola kings in Ceylon, we had about 6 to 8 during the Anuradhapura period. It is inevitable that we got Hindu gods coming into us as well. These two are Shiva Parvati and Vishnu and Lakshmi, carved at Vijayarama in Anuradhapura. Interesting to note how they have identified them. They usually look at the iconography, look at the Indian sculptures, and see whether there is any similarity with what we see here. Of course, some of them came into the mainstream Buddhism, and that was reflected in the Buddhist art. The Ganesh here is a main god, and he is seen to be worshipped by the Gana on either side, signifying that he was actually much more important in the Buddhist architecture as well, and Buddhist art and the Buddhist practices. But the most interesting during this period is this Dravidian temple. The architecture is entirely Pallava or Hindu, but it is a Buddhist temple. It has tantric carvings. The only place where we have tantric carvings is the Nalanda. I think some of the people here will remember the visit we paid a couple of years ago. And it has certain unique carvings which identifies it with the Tamil architecture. So it didn't matter whose architecture it was. As long as it served the purpose of the people, people accepted it, got it into the mainstream, and it became part of the Sinhala Buddhist art. When it comes to paintings, we followed the Ajanta tradition. There have been paintings in relic chambers at Mahiyangana and Ruwanalisaya, but there are some pictures of what was found from Mahiyangana at the National Museum. But if you really want to see original paintings, the only place we have of this particular period is a cave called Pulligoda, that is off Dimbulagala. And what I have shown you is a picture taken at Pulligoda. Moving on to Polonnaruwa, when the capitals changed, we continued the same traditions, multiplied it by many folds. But what was most striking is the change in the architecture. Instead of the stupas, the pilimages or the image houses started to dominate the landscape of the monastery. And we see massive image houses like the Thuparama building, the Lanka Tilakaya, and the Tivanka Pilimage. Interesting to note are these vimanas, which are again part of the Dravidian architecture on the outsides of the Buddhist Pilimage. So they've got these things from wherever it was available, incorporated into the Buddhist art. And so we see a mix of Dravidian architecture in the Buddhist art as well. Interestingly, the Mahayana practices by this time were in the mainstream Buddhism. And this statue, of course, shows the features of Buddhist statues during the Polonnaruwa period. But in addition to that, you can see 4 other Buddhas on the side, which are part of the Mahayana teachings, which are the Amitabha Buddhas. And in addition, you also see the Vajra, which is also part of the Mahayana. So we see Mahayana practices getting incorporated into Buddhism as well as coming into Buddhist art as time went on. We also see for the first time the Hindu deities coming into mainstream Buddhism. Now you see behind the statue of the Buddha, Mahabrahma and Indra, 2 of the Hindu gods. Mahabrahma with his 4 faces and Indra here, both in veneration of the Buddha. And the hands are in what is called the Anjali Mudra, which is the traditional way of venerating and how the artist would draw a person worshipping the Buddha. So they've all come into the picture. At this point, we see Mahayana, the Hindu worship, Hindu beliefs coming into the mainstream Buddhism and getting incorporated into Buddhist art. Paintings followed the same tradition. So we continued with what you would see at Ajanta. These were taken at Tivanka Pilimage some time back. Photography is not allowed now. Fortunately, I had some from my collection. But for the first time, we can see the Jataka stories coming into these paintings. Mahavansa, of course, says that Jataka stories were drawn inside the relic chamber of the Ruan Velisaya, but those are not to be seen anymore. Here we see the Jataka stories, and again we see the strips, and they are drawn in within these strips. You get one story in a strip. So you read from left to right the story that is drawn. With Maga, the Polonnaruwa kingdom fell, and with it ended one part of the Buddhist Sinhala art. When the cities migrated, they were unstable, so there wasn't much time for any Buddhist art to develop during this period. So the cities went from Dambadeniya to Yapahuwa to Kurunagala to Gampala and finally to Kandy. And it is around this time that we first encountered the Europeans. The Portuguese first, when they came in 1505, had only one goal, and that was to perpetuate Christianity. So, Bible in hand and a sword in the other, they vandalized whatever Buddhist structure that they could find. Buddhism had to go underground. Dutch was slightly different. Their objective was business, but of course they had the same practices. So it was a time where Buddhism was not thriving. So obviously Buddhist art would have to take a backseat. It is with this backdrop that Kirtisiri Rajasingha came to the throne of the Kandyan kingdom. With Valavita Saranankara, Kirtisri managed to get bhikkhus of higher ordination and started on what is today known as the Kandyan Buddhist revival. So obviously then, with revival of Buddhism, there was a revival of Buddhist art. We see the typical Kandyan style of Buddha statues, which are different to the earlier one. If you can appreciate the structure of the robe, the pleats that you see are much more wavy, whereas in the classical period you had very nice grooves. We also see the disappearance of the Usnisha. But in addition to that, we see the Sirsapata coming into the picture. Incidentally, the standing Buddha statues, instead of having the hand slightly down, now seem to touch the robe. And that came with the Thai influence. If you look at Thai Buddha statues, this was taken at Ayodhya, it touches the robe which is slightly open to the side. So we see the influence of the Thai monks who came to Sri Lanka to revive Buddhism, their influence coming through the Kandyan period. During the Gampala time, Mahayana had totally disappeared, but Avalokiteshvara and Maitreya had now come into the mainstream Buddhism. Avalokiteshvara became Natha. Avalokiteshvara Natha is one of his names, and he became one of our mainstream deities. And incidentally, Natha is actually not one of the Hindu gods that people know of, but he is one of our mainstream deities. He therefore became deified, and we hardly see any of his pictures thereafter in Buddhist art. However, Maitreya became the Maitri Buddha of the Theravada tradition. Iconographically, the artist drew him differently now. He is now the Buddha in waiting. He has a Jatamakuta which is like a stupa, and they used to draw a little Buddha. What was there in Avalokiteshvara's head now comes to the Maitri's head. And Maitri now occupies a pride of place in the image houses, mostly at the entrance to the image house. And this is from the Dalada Malika. So, aiming to be born when Bodhisattva Maitri becomes a Buddha is part of the mainstream Theravada Buddhism now. It was there from the Gampala period. This particular verse was how my grandmother used to end her evening worship. Every single day she used to say, I want to be born at a time when Maitri becomes a Buddha and hopefully attain Nibbana. So it was part of it. The mainstream Buddhism where art also incorporated the people's thinking. And Maitri has now become a bodhisattva who is there either at the entrance or inside the main image houses along with the Tata Gautama Buddha. But the biggest revival we saw with Buddhist art is with the drawings of the temples. Now, this was a time where people hardly knew any Buddhism. They couldn't understand the Pali words that were chanted in the temples. They could hardly read, but we still had to get the message across. So, what they did then was to draw. It was easy, a graphical display, so that you look at the pictures, get the message very simply to your mind. So, this came during the time of Kirtisri. He got people like Nilgala Parampara were the artists, and certain Silvattanas who were Ganinanses, the lay monks in the temples at that time, to draw, to attract people to the temples so that you could give the message of Buddhism to them. There were common themes like the Satsatya, the 28 Buddhas of the past, the Vivaranas, and the Solosmasthanas, and of course, not to forget, the Jataka stories. Now, these Jataka stories were like reading a book. They are drawn in tiny spaces, in little strips. You read from left to right and then go down the next line until you come to the end of the story. And it is marked with a tree or something, and the next story starts. So, this is how, during that time, we got the message to the people. So, in the Kandyan kingdom, there are the temples which had the king's patronage. All of them, without an exception, will have these features. It will have the Buddhist drawings, the temple drawings, which are known as the Kandyan school of painting, and they all convey a visual message. And to this world came the British, who ruled the maritime provinces for 17 years. And once we ceded the Kandyan kingdom, ruled the entire country for a further 73 years. And with that, the Kandyan art also died. And there was nothing for a while until there was the Buddhist revival, which happened in the 18th century. Now, this happened in the maritime provinces. We had a new group of people who were rich in their own rights, educated and Buddhists, and they wanted to do something for Buddhism. And with that, they started building temples along the coastal belt. And we see the influence of the Western cultures. Although the Portuguese and the Dutch had left by that time, their influence remained. The way we talk, the food we eat, the furniture that we sometimes use, the clothes we wear, all of them were there in the community. And they were made use of when it came to Buddhist art during this period. So you see something like a church facade at the entrance to the image house. People accepted the kings or their queens. And at the entrance to the image house, you sometimes see the royal coat of arms, picture of Victoria, or sometimes even Albert, depending on who was the king at that time. The visual art that started in the Kandyan kingdom continued in the maritime provinces as well. It is likely that the artisans traveled from the Kandyan kingdom to the maritime provinces. Or it could just be that people knew it was happening and they adopted the same practice. It's the same style that you see, strips giving a story, the same type of things, but the Jatakas were slightly different. They selected some others which they liked. The artist had the full freedom to decide on what they wanted. The most striking in the southern parts, what we see is the Western influence of the lifestyles of the people coming into the temple art. You see the dresses, the furniture across the board, and they were used to tell Jataka stories. to the people. They could relate to it. They didn't pause to think whether this was the way it happened during the Buddha's time. Was it the way it happened when he was a bodhisattva? That was immaterial. All what the artist wanted was to give a message to the people, and he used the best possible way he thought would relate to the people easily so that they could understand the story. As you can see very clearly, this is the Nataka Nalagadange Viprakara before Siddhartha left the palace. The dancers are all wearing Western dresses, and even Prince Siddhartha, seated there, looks totally Western. Nothing Indian. And it didn't matter because the message was very clear. You look at it, you know what you're looking at, even if you cannot read the writing at the bottom. He got the message very clearly to the people. Towards the end of the 19th century, or to the beginning, or around about the beginning of the 20th century, we see the influence of the church coming in. You can see these two people. This is from a church, and this is from a temple. So the cherubs are there. Of course, we see the statues becoming more prominent. They are more brick-like. They are made with bricks and stucco paintings. Very shiny, what you would see in a church. So we use that again to show something that we wanted to use. If the paintings were two-dimensional at that point, towards the 20th century, we started to make them three-dimensional. And the artists were now thinking of the context in which they were happening. So you see the trees coming in, the palaces. Clothes again were what the people wore. Now that changed in the 20th century. And there are four great painters of Buddhist art in the 20th century that I would like to very briefly talk about. First is Sarlis Master. I think most of you would have seen his pictures as litho pictures. The old houses have, the old temples have, and they are hung on the walls. So Sarlis Master's paintings are seen along these coastal areas. This is actually from Isipatanarame, just round the corner. He started to draw them as they may have been during the time of the Buddha. So this is how we imagine India at that time. Gone were the stories, reading from one side to the other. You still had panels, but each panel or each square would have one picture depicting some event. His paintings, his style was copied right along the coastal border. And we see his paintings in places in Valigama, in Mulkirigala, and even somewhere around Galevala in some other temples. It is interesting to note that he was the only artist who was copied so extensively. In the past, we see the school being perpetuated in all the regions. But with Sarlis Master's drawings, that stopped. And thereafter what we see is what an individual artist has drawn. The next person is, of course, Solis Mendes of the Calania mural frame. Now, he started drawing in other places as well. Some of his paintings are seen in Polonnaruwa, which I have seen as there. But his masterpieces are at the Calania temple. Now, Calania Image House is vast, and he uses fairly large panels. Again, the panel would consist of one story or one event. The details amazing, the style now going back to the earlier traditional type, which was like what we saw with the Ajanta paintings, the Pulligoda paintings, or the Tivanka Pilimage paintings. His style was different to Sarlis Master's. Interestingly, he also drew events from the Sri Lankan history as part of his murals. Gone were the Jataka stories. He didn't draw any Jataka story in the Calania murals. If you go there, you will see that the newer Image House has no Jataka stories. Stories from the life of the Buddha, as well as events from the Sri Lankan Buddhist history, particularly those from the Calania region. Of course, this is well known, the tsunami at that time, which came to Calania, and this is how we saw it. The next great painter is George Keat. George Keats' paintings are found at Gotami Vihare. Keats' style was totally different, very artistic. But when you look at what he has drawn, you can relate to it because the dresses are what a Sinhalese village person would wear. He made it different with the jewelry that he used on these people. And incidentally, you can see Yashodhara as a dark skinned person. So Keat was a totally different ball game altogether. His drawings are amazing and it's well worth a visit to Gotami Vihare to see. My favorite was the Buddha's visit to Kimbulwatpura, where he has drawn Yashodhara with Prince Rahula, showing him the father, and you can visualize the Narasiha Gatha simply by looking at that picture. It's one amazing, beautiful picture that he has done there. Of course, closer to home is the Bellangwila temple, and Somabandhu Vidyapati is the fourth artist that I would like to bring you to your notice. He is again using the classical style. He uses the entire wall to draw something, each event merging seamlessly with the other. There are different events from the life of the Buddha. Style very classical. He uses a lot of colors and gets the expressions of the face that he wants. But to me, his masterpiece is this. For the first time, we see an artist drawing us something which makes us think of what the Buddha taught or what he said. This is the Mara Parajaya, going away from the traditional way of thinking. What exactly is Mara Parajaya? Is it vanquishing an army? What army is the Buddha talking of then? So you see the lust, the greed, the vices of the man which he tries to throw away. And Somabandhu goes and draws it on the temple wall. This is the one place where I saw an artist going away from the simple thing that is said in the scriptures and making you think of what exactly happened. So Buddhist art over the years also gives an important message about what is acceptable. Now, this is the story of Patachara, taken from the Kataluwa Purana Viharya around the 18th to the 19th century. You can see a naked Patachara walking, coming to see the Buddha, and then she gets a piece of cloth to cover the bottom. Of course, people were bare-breasted at that time, and the artist saw nothing wrong in that. That is what the story says. Patachara came naked to see the Buddha. He drew it. However, in the 20th century, it is probably not what you might want to see in a mural. And the artist here is much more cautious. And we see the same story, the abject misery, Patachara going to the Buddha, but the artist had not been brave enough to draw a naked woman in the temple. It is important for the artist to be aware of what the people at that time would want to see. And we see that happening. What happens if they are not careful? This painting is taken from Ginivalle Purana Vihara. This was a joint venture between a group of Dutch artists sponsored by the Dutch government to draw murals in a temple deep down south. That is, Kataluwa is somewhere around Koggala. So they use models from the village, drew what they thought was right, which didn't go down so well with the people. And you can see how the people have tried to damage some of these. These large parts that you see here are what have been totally painted over. It's obvious, because if that is to show Theri Sangamitta coming with the bow sapling, obviously this is not going to evoke any piety. The pictures that have been totally covered are available on the web, and you can understand why people were not comfortable in seeing those postures, those images on a temple wall. So it's important that artists be aware of what the people want. I told you at the very beginning that for the art to flourish, people need to accept it. If they had been mindful of what the people wanted, we may have ended up with another school, a totally different school of art. This is one of the remaining few at Guinevere, where you see the people coming out of the wall, dancing, such amazing paintings, simply because they were not aware of what people wanted and what was acceptable to people. We lost that type of an art in this country. So, ladies and gentlemen, to answer the question that I set out to answer, what exactly is Buddhist art of the Sinhalese? How do I see it? Of course, it goes without saying that it is probably the oldest living Buddhist art in this world. Because by the 10th century, Buddhist art in India had already gone off. There are archaeological monuments now in India, not so in Sri Lanka. Ours is a living art which evolves over time. And in any one place, we would see, as I said, things from the 2nd century BC to the 21st century, because it is the place that we go to venerate. It is not an archaeological monument. The other most important thing is that due to where the country is, we see influences coming from different parts of the world. And we see how the artists have used them and made them ours and taken them beyond what it was when they first came. It is a mix of different religious cultures, which are not necessarily directly related. They were able to bring it in because it had some sort of a semblance to the religious beliefs of the people and incorporated it. But to me, the most beautiful part of Buddhist art of the Sinhalese is that it has been evolving and adaptive, and it is the one way in which we can show inclusivity and justify tolerance and diversity in a community. My acknowledgements are too many. Sorry. Every time I go to a place, I meet many people. And I'm very grateful to their patience because I spend hours in these places and they have to keep that place open, which they generously do. I'm deeply indebted for their generosity, for sharing the knowledge that they have. All the monks that I have met, the lay custodians of these image houses have been very, very cooperative. To my travel partners, thank you very much for your patience and for your company. That is what makes traveling much more enjoyable. I hope I have been able to justify your long hours of traveling with me. And to all of you, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Madam, for that wonderful talk. We have gone on certain trips, and you have inspired us and taught us a lot of these things. Just two comments. Number one is I ask you to put out a coffee table book based on all your pictures as well as your travel diaries, if possible, a vlog. Number two is just a comment of that picture that you showed of Salis Master. Every time when I used to visit a Buddhist house as a Christian, I used to see those pictures, what you say. And the very particular picture that you showed is similar to what a Christian household may have. Presentation of Jesus to Simeon, right, at the dedication. I hope you can show that. I wonder whether there was an influence of Salis Master from Christian art more or less during the British time.
It's possible, Shehan, that he may have been influenced by the Christian art that he has seen. The interesting thing is the fact that he thought of the context, that it is probably Indian. And I think the one before that, please.
The one before, yes.
Yeah, that one. So you see the dresses that he has, drawn, which looks pretty much like what you would say in India, probably at that time, including the shoes, those little upturned shoes that you see that the people are wearing. I'm not very sure whether it was influenced directly by the Christian art that he has seen, but it's very possible because you can't totally separate what you see when you start drawing.
Exactly.
It gets into you and you sort of, show what you see. So it's quite possible. Madam.
That was a brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
And as I told you earlier, it's high time you wrote it up for a PhD. Have you done that already? Because I mentioned that earlier when you had your presentation on Buddhist paintings, temple paintings. The other thing, Virakodi, I saw that you had a picture of Prasanna Virakodi. He also does a lot of historic paintings.
Yes, ma'am.
And have you seen the one on the destruction of the Kalani Vihara?
Yes, madam. That's the one I put up actually, the Portuguese one.
And his father, Aryavansa Virakodi, also they both had a lot of paintings on historic events.
Okay.
It was a wonderful presentation, and
Thank you, madam.
it was really It was enjoyable going through it, and it just shows, and it showed my ignorance, And I think many of us in the audience also have learned so much. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank
madam.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chandni. That's an excellent presentation. When you showed those, the art and the statues, when you came to Kandy, much late. So what was happening in Kandy before that? Was there nothing happening, or was there any art parallel to Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa?
So it's very difficult to find any evidence of what happened in the art. So possibly there may have been certain things going on, but it's not really visible until we came to this particular period. We see evidence from the Gampala period, definitely. Like Lankatilaka and Gadaladeniya, the original structures are Gampala. But then again, when it came to the Kandian period, the Rajasingha's period, Kirtisri's period, we see a lot of overpainting. So we may have lost whatever that was there. And overpainting is very common in the Sinhala Buddhist art, because once the walls get damaged, or if you want to get a new style, you just overpaint and you see the ones underneath when they start peeling off. So there were certain types of art in the Gampala period which were an extension of the Polonnaruwa type. So when you go to Gadaladeni or Lankatilaka, you will see the buildings just like what you see in Polonnaruwa, but much more involvement with the Dravidian art. So they have again come into the mainstream.
Yeah, so and you had so many compliments from the audience, but I think this lecture is so good that you should give this to probably the British Museum, because they have a lot of art. Maybe it's worth exploring that possibility. Maybe if you have any contacts, maybe you should do that. And finally, I think the director of archaeology has got the sack. And you have experience, you have good experience as the deputy director, so why not take it up?
Architecture at the time, things like Ranmasuviyana and places like that.
I didn't touch it, because I selected the topic of Buddhist architecture. But if you look at Ranmasuviyana, again, you see the Gandhara style coming in, especially with those elephants that go to, at the bottom. It's like a group of elephants going for a bath, and you see the similar things with the Gandhara paintings. So I didn't go into those because I've actually shortened quite a lot of what I had earlier. Poor Nalina, of course, got the original one, and then a quick message saying, please delete, I have reduced the slides, and sending him the second one. So I tried to keep to the time that Dominda gave. I hope I managed to do it in 45 minutes. But you're right, because you get a lot of different art which are not really Buddhist art as such, particularly in the Anuradhapura period, because everything had a carving. So you will see a lot of different things and different structures as well.
I believe now the audience understand why I kept you away from medicine topics. We would not have enjoyed your lecture on pharmacology like this, the way we enjoyed this. Thank you very much for your excellent talk. Are there any wooden carvings?
Yes, a
during
lot.
this? You didn't touch on that.
Yes, I did. Actually, I didn't say that. Now, some of these statues that you see are wooden. So you see the statues, they are sometimes made out of wood and painted over. So the base structure is wooden. You see small ones as well as big ones. If you go to the museum, you'll see a whole heap of them. The wooden carvings were more in the Kandyan period. And they actually helped people to carry them around so that they could take it and worship wherever they wanted. So same goes to the smaller bronze ones. So yes, there are a lot.